An official good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to our fourth quarter webinar, which also happens to be the last for 2023. My name is Bridget J, and I'll be your host for this insightful webinar on integrating ESG strategies into business operations. Our session today will discuss what ESG is, the essence of ESG, and the role impact experience in ESG. What they will do today is to help us understand the strategies to be adopted in ESG. And then they will also shed light on how these strategies that they will point us to will create a long-term value for our businesses. So just to run you through our order, our speakers will each have a 20-minute session. And during this session, kindly submit your questions through the chat box that you see on your screens. And also, I would encourage that we make this very interactive to hear your thoughts, and you can share this through the same medium. So without further delay, I will just give you a brief insight on ESG. So in the last couple of years, I am certain that we have heard or read ESG somewhere. Now, to briefly give you an understanding of what ESG is, the E in ESG simply means environment, in terms of the environment in which we work in and how it impacts the environment. The S we work in, and then the G stands for governance, in terms of the larger corporate bodies, and then the transparency and governance in terms of the workplace, the corporate structures that are being put in place in the company. And so you would agree also that traditionally in the past, the focus of most businesses has been the financial impact that these businesses have, or have been the financial performance, if I should say. Now, today, aside this financial performance, modern businesses are also, moving or adding on to this financial performance by adding non-financial performance as well. Now, by non-financial performance, I am referring to ESG activities. Now, ESG involves the sustainable activities and ethical practices that we carry out in business. ESG factors has also become a major consideration ESG strategies that companies adopt to create a long-term value. Now, again, our environment has become a very important part of our business, and businesses now focus on the environments that they work in. And I mean, one major thing that I would say has become key for our environments is consideration reduce carbon dioxide. Sure, I'm certain that you have heard the adoption of renewable energy resources. We've heard so much about going green and then embracing solar. These are all steps towards advancing the environment in which we work in, and then making it a better place for everyone. So for those in the extractive industry in Ghana as well, you would realize that there are a series of assessments that are being put in place during the operations in the extractive industry. There's more emphasis also on transparency in business. You would realize that day in, day out, employees want more from the businesses or from the board with which they look up to. There needs to be transparency in the board. There needs to be transparency within the shareholders. There needs to be an engagement of the employees. And so, in terms of the social activities, you realize that employers are striving hard to, have a connection between employees and employers. And so, this is all trying to create an enabling environment for all employees. So today, we have some companies that have defined or prioritized ESG goals, and they've set targets to achieve their ESG. There are continuous stakeholder engagements, which are also try to implement the ESG about the COP, the COP 23 events that took place. That is the conference of parties that has just recently taken place. These are all activities that are geared towards climate change and sustainable development. So in Ghana also, there are, certain incentives that have been put in place for the extractive industry, like I said, in terms of environmental impact assessment activities. And then for the banking sector as well, the Bank of Ghana has created or has implemented certain frameworks to help individuals or corporations in the banking sector to adopt ESG measures. In actual fact, we have the Sustainable Banking Principles Sector Guidelines, and this is set for all banking institutions to adopt ESG measures in terms of the framework in which they work in. We also have the Ghana Stock Exchange guidance manual for companies that are listed on the stock exchange. And so these are all measures that have been put in place for companies that are working in the financial institutions and companies that are listed on the stock exchange to adopt ESG measures to, to make it an easier environment for now for us at Koranteng and Koranteng especially, we have also been involved in the Green Ghana campaign, and which involves which has seen us, taking part in the tree planting activities within the community in which we work in. We have also recently been involved in community support where we have taken up CSR, corporate social responsibility activities where we have by engaging the community through leadership skills and then just community support here and here out. So today what we are going to do with this very brief background that I have provided is speak to very talented professionals who will educate us on ESG. First off, we are going to speak to Teresa Effie Cook. Effie would give us a 20-minute session where she would brief us basically on ESG. Now, Effie is 25 years. She has 25 years extensive experience in human resource management with strategic insights in the space of people, culture, and organizational development. Most recently, Effie served as the Global Director of People and Culture at Delight Design, where she oversaw a comprehensive range of HR functions on a global scale, managing a team of HR experts across the globe. Effie's role encompasses organizational development, integrated talent management, leadership development, culture, and critically, ESG initiatives and reporting. Her career also includes a significant stint at Opportunity International as the Africa Regional Director for Human Resources, where she was instrumental in implementing strategic HR policies and practices across the multiple countries. At Delight Design, Effie has been very pivotal in integrating ESG initiatives into the core of HR practices and business operation, which ensures that these strategies are not just add-ons, but embedded in the fabric of the organizations and cultural operations. The approach to ESG in HR has been holistic, she says. From her profile, as she has touched on aspects like talent acquisition, diversity and inclusion, employment engagement, and performance management. So today, Effie will share very valuable insights and learning on how ESG strategies are continuously shaping HR practices. She will draw from her rich experience background and her diverse experiences and give us deep knowledge into ESG criteria. And then she will rope in her HR functions as I have just read to you. So without further delay, I will hand over the virtual floor to Effie so she takes us through this. Effie.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bridget. Thank you. So thank you, Bridget, and thank you to the Koranteng and Koranteng team for organizing this webinar, and you're giving us the opportunity to share and learn this afternoon. I have a deck of slides. I don't know whether you'll share it. I don't think it's needed for this conversation. So if you can't share it, it's fine. But I just wanted to sort of talk.
Hi, Effie. I will share my screen. Yes, I will share my screen.
Okay, you don't have to if it's going to interrupt the presentation, because we can have this conversation without it. So 5 years ago, when I began my work in this space, ESG was not a business imperative.
Not at all. No, not at all.
It has become today. I think there's a bit of a delay. So, right, I was saying 5 years ago, when I began my work in this space, ESG was not a business imperative that it has become today. The concept of ESG has gained significant traction in the business world in recent years. It's now spoken about everywhere you go. You now hear about ESG, which wasn't the case 5 years ago. But before we sort of launch into sort of what ESG is, I guess the first part is to understand what it means. What do we mean when we say ESG? I think Bridget has given a fairly good synopsis of what ESG is, but I'll take the opportunity to sort of echo her words a little bit. So environmental, social, and governance, that's what gives us those words, ESG. And these strategies refer to a set of standards for a company's operations that socially conscious, and I want to emphasize that socially conscious investors use to screen potential investments. That is why now it's a big deal. It's the principles have always been there, but it's because now socially conscious investors are using this to screen potential investors. That is why it's made ESG quite prominent now, and a concept that is constantly being spoken about by businesses. Now, these strategies, when we talk about environment, what do we mean? The environmental criteria. These considers how a company performs as a steward of nature. How are you looking after your environment? And it looks at things like climate change policies, energy use policies, waste management policies, and conservation of natural resources. When we talk about social, the social criteria looks at things like how a company and its managers build relationships with their stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, I mean employees, suppliers, customers, and the community in which that company actually operates. So how are you behaving to the people who work for you, to the people who do business with you, to the community that you serve? And then when we talk about governance, we're talking about how a company deals with its leadership, including the board, and how a company manages executive pay, for instance. You remember a few years back, there were issues in the financial sector where there were directors that were earning extreme bonuses, etc. And particularly in the countries like the United States, etc. These became very, very big issues that the business world was having to deal with. So governance looks at those things. It looks like audits and internal controls of the organization. And it also looks at shareholder rights. How are the owners of the business behaving vis-a-vis the communities that they serve in? So really, an ESG framework evaluates how a company polices itself, right? So how do you police yourself, and how transparent are you in your operations? And how do you handle things like conflict of interest, etc.? So that's what an ESG framework allows an organization to do. I hope that, thank you, Bridget, for that slide. Like I said, if it's a distraction, you don't have to bother with it. I can talk about this. So the idea is that companies that score well in these areas are better and long-term bets for investors because they are potentially less risky. ESG frameworks allows you to basically assess risk, etc. And so investors are very aware and sort of have transparent insights into our organization's performance. Additionally, these strategies also appeal to investors who wish to make a positive impact with their money. So it's not just about profits, but it's about that third bottom line of impact, so how our organizations impacting the environment. So over time, ESG has evolved from what I was then a fairly niche idea, to a central consideration in business strategy and investment. And it's now looking at, how businesses basically are reflecting a broader shift in societal values and expectation. So ESG now has evolved from a niche interest to a central consideration of business strategy, investment decision, regulatory frameworks. The role in shaping sustainable and responsible business practices obviously continues to grow. So this is shifting. It's a very dynamic area. Every year there's a new aspect to ESG. So I think you can pause here, Bridget, and I'll come to you on the next slide if you don't mind. You can just pause on the slide for a minute. So why has, in the scheme of things, why would we say ESG has become a business imperative today? A few things, and there's an increasing importance in investment decisions. So investors are increasingly considering ESG factors as essential components in their investment decisions. So, if you're going to borrow, most of the development agencies out there will actually come and evaluate your business performance on your ESG framework. So how are you doing when it comes to the metrics that you set for yourself on ESG, if you have? And if you haven't, they will put a criteria in place for you to have some metrics before they lend to you. There's also regulatory pressure and on reporting standards. So there's a global trend now towards stricter regulatory requirements for ESG disclosures. So businesses are actually being asked to disclose on ESG. This push is driving companies, obviously, to adopt more transparent and standardized reporting practices. The EU, for example, has been at the forefront of implementing regulations that mandate ESG reporting for very large companies. There's corporate strategy and risk. Businesses are integrating ESG now into their strategic planning and risk management frameworks. This integration helps companies to mitigate risk and capitalize on new opportunities and ensure long-term sustainability. There is also consumer and employee expectation. The rising awareness and concern about the environment and social issues, and we see that particularly on social media these days. It's among consumers and employees are influencing companies and their practices. So companies with strong ESG commitments are often found more attractive to both consumers and talent, and enhancing the brand and their competitiveness. There's also technology. Data analytics, we are all seeing what AI is doing today. The use of technology in monitoring and reporting ESG metrics has become much, much more sophisticated. So companies are leveraging big data and analytics to measure their ESG performance more accurately and to identify areas for improvement. There is, I think, perhaps more now than ever before, numerous global and local initiatives encouraging ESG practice. So, for example, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDG, and we've all been talking about it. It's a fundamental framework that companies use to align their ESG efforts. So you look at the organization and look at how are they meeting the SDG goals. Of course, it all sounds very positive as a framework to deploy in your business, but there are also challenges and criticisms. So despite the growing popularity of that ESG has, it also faces challenges, such as some companies greenwashing, and I'm sure other speakers may elaborate on this. And this is where companies exaggerate their environmental efforts and lack of standardization ESG metrics. So people would project that they're doing amazing things on the environment when they're really not. And that's one of the major criticisms that ESG as a framework faces. On the future trends, we are likely to see greater integration of ESG into core business strategies. More robust and standardized reporting frameworks are being developed constantly. And I'm sure in the course of this webinar, other speakers will elaborate on that. And there's also an increased emphasis on climate change. And I think Bridget just spoke about the COP28 that's happening right now. So there's a real emphasis on climate change and also social justice issues. So we talk about diversity, inclusion, etc. So these are all trends, and these are all pieces of the ESG framework that businesses are going to have to think through how they integrate into their business practices. Let me speak a little bit about how ESG practices and the ESG frameworks that I've worked with have been impacting human resources. At Delight, where I've been until like a few days ago, my role was pivotal in integrating ESG initiatives into the core of our HR practices and business operations, ensuring that these strategies are not just add-ons, they are not just nice to haves, but are embedded in the fabric of the organization's culture and operations. So we were very intentional in ensuring that our ESG framework runs alongside, not just runs alongside our business, but is integrated into the way in which we work. So our culture, i.e. the way we do things, is predicated on our ESG framework. So the approach to ESG in HR has been holistic. And we look at ESG when it comes to talent acquisition, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, employee engagement, and performance management. In integrating ESG into our HR strategies, this has not only aligned with our broader corporate sustainability goals, but we also address the evolving expectations of our employees. As society is changing, our employee expectations are also changing. So our ESG framework allows us to easily evolve alongside our employees and the community, the societies in which we operate across the world. So how have we done this? I'll give you a few examples. When you look at talent acquisition and retention, I would say that Gen Z and millennials are pretty focused on organizations that have ethical practices. So we make sure that in our values statements, when you say corporate, when you go to an organization and you see their values plastered on the wall or their objectives plastered on the wall, etc. And the ethos of that is to ensure that you are communicating who you are as an organization. And so we made sure that in that value statement, in our core values, in our mission statements, in our objectives, etc., that our ESG is strongly, we speak strongly to our ethical position around our business. So that's very fundamental. In terms of employee retention, we know that employees are more aligned to stay with organizations where their values align with the employer's brand and the organization's values as well. So we're making sure that our values does reflect what our employer brand is. So things like non-discrimination, things like that, diversity and inclusion are really important to us. So ESG, through our ESG framework, we've been able to emphasize the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. So our strategies around that are fundamental to our organizational culture. So this is just some of the ways that we are using our ESG framework to influence and embed in the way that we do business. So when you look at, for example, employee engagement and employee well-being, again, that's one of our pillars on our ESG framework. How are we as an organization embedding employee well-being into the way that we manage people? So ESG initiatives lead to levels of employee engagement, and we've noticed this. in the way when we changed some of our policies around, work from home, hybrid working, and all of these things. It really did influence our engagement levels. And it's very clear that our employees required it as part of their well-being processes, particularly at the beginning of COVID in 2020, when suddenly people couldn't come to work because of risk. Our shift toward hybrid models, etc., was really appreciated by the teams, and this has become a fundamental piece of our ESG framework. So when it comes to things like health and safety is a big fundamental piece of our ESG framework. So we are very particular around how our teams are working. Our organization is very much a field-based organization. So employees are out there riding. I think in Ghana, it's maybe it's just motorbikes, but in East Africa, we call them border. Staff are on motorbikes riding across country. So how do we make sure that these people are safe? By making sure we provide the right PPE, by making sure we provide adequate training, by monitoring, etc., to make sure that employees are safe. So all of those pieces are sort of fundamental to how we are treating the people that work for us. And that sort of fits into the social, the S of ESG. As a business, we were very much an environmentally focused organization because we're a solar business. So that met very much the E of ESG. When it comes to governance, ensuring that there was a female representation at board level, female representation in executive management, making sure that there are pathways for growth for women within the organization. All of that speaks to the piece around governance. And so gender was a big conversation for us. And we ensure that in our talent hiring, in our performance management, in our promotions, progression, in our leadership selections, etc., that we look at things with a gender lens. So these are some of the ways that we have practiced ESG and embedded that into the way and manner in which we do business. I'm not sure how many minutes I have, and you can give me a heads up if Bridget, if I'm near enough to my time. But I think these are some of the pieces that sort of from an operational perspective, a business embeds into their business. So another example I could sort of use to describe how we've embedded ESG principles is, for example, the way in which we deal with our customers. So our products are sold to customers on a pay-as-you-go basis, for example. So the customer will buy the product and will pay over time. So what we've done is to make sure that our policies around that lending is very clear. So we have very clear policies around how you pay for the product, what happens if you don't pay, what happens if we have to reprocess, etc. We're very, very clear policies around that, and well documented and communicated to our clients. So what we found is that to be able to do this, we have to first do an internal gap analysis to see, given our operation and given the standards that we wanted to establish on our ESG framework, where are our gaps? And we used several models of the frameworks. The Sustainable Development Goals as one. We operate in an association called Bugla, and therefore their standards were also one. So, the people who lend to us have standards, so we looked at that. And then we assessed internally to say, where's the gap between what we do and what we are expected to do? And out of that, we built an action plan. And so for the last 3 years, we've been executing that action plan. Obviously, it's a society shift. And as society shifts, we also have to look at where we are and look at our gaps and then continuously model what the action plan looks like. So we have been very intentional in that process. So that's what's got us where we are today. So to wrap up, I would say, thank you, time out. To wrap up, I would say,
not yet. We can do another 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I don't even need that. I'll just wrap up and say, businesses will have no choice but to look at their operations and look at what standards they are implementing. And as far as I'm concerned, and what I've seen over the period that I've been working in this space, I say ESG is good business. ESG is best practice. And so hopefully all organizations are open to implementing these within their spaces. Thank you. I think I'll wrap up here, and I think we'll take questions at the end of the other speakers.
Okay. Thank you, Effie. We will take questions at the end of the session when all the other speakers have finished as well. So thank you for kicking off the session with that valuable information on ESG, especially on being intentional about integrating ESG into our business through business culture and value, and employee, and how this has influenced the engagement of employees was very important. So now we will move on to our next panelist. Our next speaker will be Adam Smith Anthony. Adam would delve into international ESG practices and reporting standards. He would also look at ESG and supply chain, the ESG strategies that you can adopt, and then conclude on the future of ESG. Now, Adam is the head of business and human rights practice at Omnia Strategy. He's a qualified solicitor advocate specializing in public international human rights law. His broad experience also encompasses employment, intellectual property, consumer and commercial law. Adam advises and represents business on matters of corporate responsibility and business and human rights, providing legal, communications, and commercial supports. Adam has advised on state entities. He's also advised state entities in respect of public international law matters, including international criminal law and international humanitarian law, and accountability mechanisms. He has acted as lead negotiator and counsel on a strategic infrastructure deal for an Eastern and has experience advising on matters of international enforcement, trust, and management. So I do kindly welcome provide very insightful presentation of his bits on ESG. So Adam, the floor is all yours now. I will share my screen so you can, yeah.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you to your colleagues at Koranteng for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here speaking with you all this afternoon and to join Effie and John on the panel. It's a particular pleasure to follow that excellent presentation from Effie that has, I think, set the scene remarkably well. And you have, from Effie's remarks, a really good understanding of the breadth of ESG, the pace of change, the utility of ESG and some of this reporting to investors, and perhaps a sense of the opportunities as well as the very many challenges. It's my role and pleasure to provide something of an international perspective. And I do that having joined Omnia Strategy nearly 10 years ago to lead the human rights team, and particularly with a focus on advising businesses on their approach to human rights. Omnia Strategy is an international law firm that was set up by Cherie Blair, the wife of former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, and Cherie set up Omnia in large part with a dedicated focus on bringing mainstream quality human rights advice to companies and also to governments. And we now have a track record of some 11, 12 years of advising on some of these very challenging aspects that Effie has already outlined. So in terms of the top 5 key global sustainability trends that you may see when the slides load up, from talking to international companies, regional companies, governments, policymakers, and NGOs, including recently at the UN General Assembly in New York, I think really the top trends coming out of this ESG discussion are these. Firstly, climate action and the urgency of the need around climate. And of course, we're talking just as the COP, the latest climate change COP, is starting to wrap up, and we're all wondering what will happen there in terms of agreement. Secondly, you can see there sustainability and how to address this in a world of inflationary pressures and high cost of living. Thirdly, the rise of nature and natural capital. So how can you also protect biodiversity as a crucial element in planetary health at the same time as pushing for climate, reduction in carbon, and also the various other social and governance aspects that we've started to touch on. Fourthly, human rights in the supply chain. Now, large companies in Africa will be both members of supply chains and value chains of companies elsewhere, and they will have their own suppliers around the world. So when you're looking beyond the business that you can control yourself, your own organization, how do you ensure that you are partnering with other organizations that share your values and are not going to get you into trouble by implicating you in some human rights or ESG problem? And lastly, mandatory due diligence and disclosure. And we'll come on to focus on this in a little while. Let me just start my timer. Okay, so I'm on slide 3 now, Bridget, and I'm not going to scare you by going through any of this in detail, but I was struck when Effie said that ESG is an area that's very dynamic and that every year there is some change. Now, this map was produced already 2 or 3 years ago in 2021, and it sets out some of the different initiatives around business and human rights. You can see that there's some legislation there, some national action plans, which are basically government policy documents, other authoritative guidance, joint action platforms, and different benchmarks and databases. And all of those different dots spreading out from the middle are showing what has been introduced at in different years, starting way back in 2011. But it's 2011 that I think, for our purposes, is a very good starting point. And that's because it was in 2011 that the UN, the Human Rights Council, unanimously adopted something called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Now, this sits alongside various of the other initiatives that you may have heard of and that we've mentioned already, including the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Global Compact. But I would suggest to you that the UNGPs is, if you take nothing away from my presentation at all, take away that the UNGPs are worth some further thought if you're working in business. They have become the authoritative global standard on businesses' responsibility to respect human rights. And in particular, what it is that businesses should do, as opposed to what it is that is within the state responsibility. So if we move on to the next slide, here we have some further thoughts at the top on what the UNGPs say. It basically comes in 3 parts, or in 3 pillars, as they say. The first is that state duty to protect. Now, that is a reminder that the nation state remains, from an international law point of view, the primary duty bearer, so the entity with the fundamental responsibility to protect human rights. And so that is a positive obligation to do everything necessary to safeguard the rights of those within its jurisdiction. Now, the UN Guiding Principles acknowledge that this might be through enforcement, it might be through civil law, criminal law, administrative action, and indeed it says that there should be a smart mix of measures. So basically, states shouldn't put all of their eggs in one basket and assume that, you know, the one way to do this is to have, you know, huge fines or criminal prosecutions. Instead, they should have different measures that apply to different situations. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, this business responsibility to respect. Now, this was the real landmark progression in international soft law. I say soft law because the UNGPs are not binding. They are effectively soft law in that they are their guidance. They have an authority because of the process that went into making them and the fact that they have been adopted by the UN. But also these days, 10 years on, or more than that, I think they have an authority because of the number of different businesses which publicly say that they align their business activities and their governance and all of their policies and procedures to the requirements set out in the UN guiding principles. Thirdly, the pillar of access to effective remedy. Now, the UNGPs say that this is partly the responsibility of the state, but also partly the responsibility of companies to ensure that any individual who has a right, which has been undermined or, in the words of the guiding principles, adversely affected or impacted, then those individuals or those groups of people should be able to get remedy for that violation. Now, the box at the bottom of the slide here takes you through what I would describe as 3 different stages in new national and regional laws that have been introduced in recent years. The first category I've called their disclosure requirements, but with no liability attached to it, so no sanctions. Examples of this are the various national modern slavery acts, and I've listed there some from the UK, from Australia, one from only this year in Canada. Before all of those, there was one in California. And essentially what these laws did was impose on companies the obligation to publish and to disclose sensitive information that otherwise they likely wouldn't choose to make public, specifically around those steps being taken by companies to address the risk of modern slavery in their supply chains. Typically that covers trafficking, forced labor, child labor, and then depending on the law, potentially forced marriage, bonded labor, and other similar problems. The next category here has HRDD with no liability as its heading. Now, HRDD is my shorthand for human rights due diligence. And here, the laws are starting to require companies to talk about the processes that they have to identify and manage human rights impacts. But again, with no sanctions. So no punishment, no fines typically being attached to any wrongdoing. So again, it's all about requiring companies to put more information into the public domain. And again, there are some examples listed there. Thirdly, and I think most interestingly for our purposes, and where we're seeing the most change now is the category of human rights due diligence, but where some liability provision has been included. Now, there have been a number of laws, particularly in Europe, but not only, where we are seeing this type of regulation come in. France was really first in 2017, and then Norway and Germany came very close together. Across the Atlantic, from where I am now in the US, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act took a much more blunt approach to these issues, but with a specific focus on a part of China called the Xinjiang Autonomous Uyghur region. And then thirdly, and we'll come back to talk about this, the EU Draft Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. Next slide. But before we come to that, I want to touch on another aspect that Effie had talked about earlier, and this is around reporting and sustainability reporting, and again focusing on the EU. Now, I'm focusing on the EU for 3 reasons. I'm very conscious that I'm talking to a mainly African audience, but the 3 reasons are these. Firstly, the EU, as Effie said, is at the forefront of trying to regulate on these matters. It's doing that for a mixture of reasons: domestic policy reasons, foreign policy reasons, and I think sometimes because they genuinely think that it's a good thing to be doing. I also suspect that many companies are doing this because it's much easier to get companies to police their own human rights impacts than to expect governments and their enforcement agencies to be able to do that themselves. So firstly, the EU is at the forefront. Secondly, it's an example of what other types of law we may see cropping up in the world elsewhere, and I include in Africa. So some of the tools being used by EU lawmakers here may well be picked up by politicians seeking to legislate on this in Asia, in Northern South America, in Africa and elsewhere. And thirdly, and most immediately, perhaps for this audience, I mention it because there is both a direct and an indirect impact on businesses in Africa of these European laws. So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, I put some information there, and perhaps Bridget will make these slides available to anyone who wants to have them, so that we don't need to go through them too much here. But what I want to impress upon all of you is that this is a huge undertaking being imposed on companies in the scope of the law. Now, as Effie rightly said, the CSRD, as it's called, does only apply to the very large companies. And even within those companies, there's a phased introduction for when this law starts to bite. You can see the stated objectives of this law listed there. One of those touches on something Effie mentioned earlier, which is the fourth bullet there, which is about allowing investors, firms and other stakeholders to meaningfully be able to compare the sustainability performance of one company to another, and to use that information when they're making their own investment decisions. But investors aren't the only drivers of this sustainability discussion. Employees increasingly want to work for companies that share their values and are making a positive difference in the world. Other business partners need to know with whom they can work reliably without getting into dicey territory from a human rights or an environmental point of view. And of course, policymakers have an interest, and where you are working with the government, you want to be able to show that you are a trusted partner and someone who can help advance national policy objectives. Now, there's a reference here to the 12 different standards. Now, these standards cover the full gamut of ESG and then general principles. I won't go into that too much now, save to say that there are a huge number of topics, subtopics, sub-subtopics, and then for each of those, different requirements around disclosing targets, policies, metrics and measurements, key performance indicators, and other more qualitative, less numerative disclosures. And we're in the process of working with various clients on this now, and it is, even for very sophisticated companies who have been doing this a long time, it's a really serious and very challenging undertaking. And coming back to that point around direct and indirect impact, yes, this does focus, in terms of who's in the scope of the law directly, focuses on large companies based in Europe or trading in Europe. But how are they going to get all of this information, which includes information about their suppliers, their raw materials, the environmental effect that they're having around the world? They're going to get that information by questionnaires, by visiting their suppliers, by auditing. They're going to tighten their contracts, which is a point we'll come on to. So if your business is in the supply chain of any of these big companies that's in scope in Europe, then you should expect to start getting a lot of questions around how you are contributing as a business partner to this company to their ESG impact, their ESG risk, and also to their reporting. Now, let me touch on just briefly at the bottom there, the reference to double materiality. Now, this is at the heart of the CSRD framework and system. And the idea here is that a company should look both at the impact on the company of these various ESG factors or topics. Now, that is a very, very traditional sense of due diligence for any company. but secondly, to look at the impact of the company on these ESG issues outside. Now, that is a different way of thinking for most businesses, at least most of the international businesses that I have been working with over the years. And it does require a very different mindset to start thinking about whose rights or what rights are you impacting through your business operations. Let's move on to the next slide. The next slide focuses on not on reporting, but on due diligence. And this is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Now, unlike the CSRD, this is not yet in force. There has been a long period of gestation, if you will, which is described in the first section there, dating back all the way to February, April 2020, when the European policymakers were trying to get their head around various different policy drivers, and then confronted by a new pandemic. One commissioner, who is the Commissioner for Justice, popped up with this proposal that he was going to introduce mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence rules for companies. He said it would be cross-sector, it would be upstream and downstream. It would apply, he said, to all companies, and that it would come with sanctions attached, because in his words, a regulation without sanctions is no regulation at all. So fast forward to the present day, we have got to the point now where the European Commission has formally started the process, which it did back in 2022, by publishing its own draft directive. And now the other organs of the EU, namely the Parliament and the European Council, or the Council of the European Union, which represents the member states, are in intense negotiations around finalizing this text. Those negotiations are happening as we speak, and one of the reasons for the intensity is that the term of the European Parliament ends next June, so they have a clear deadline to hit if they're going to pass this legislation before they all have to be re-elected, or before their summer holidays at least. And secondly, it's intense because of the great amount of corporate lobbying, of NGO advocacy, of different policymakers giving their view, of member states and even states, governments of states in other places in the world, also contributing their view to what this should look like. Now, I won't go into the full details of what the law will say for two reasons. One is it will take us too long, but I can come back to that in the questions if you like. And two, because, as I say, the law has not yet been finalised, and we wait to see what text can be adopted, if any. But let me leave you with two thoughts. Firstly, due diligence means, in this context, the process of identifying, managing, prioritizing, acting on, and then reporting your human rights and environmental adverse impacts. So similar to the discussion around CSRD, it's all about identifying how your business, both in its own operations and through its supply chain and its downstream value chain, how it affects the human rights of people outside of the organization, how it affects environmental standards outside of the organization. It comes with a requirement to report on this annually. It comes with the threat or the provision for enforcement in the form of civil liability and also administrative action. So we wait to see what comes next. The other particularly interesting topical discussion point around the CSDD directive at the moment, as part of this negotiation between the Parliament and the Council, is whether or not the financial services industry will be included. As you will have heard me say, the intention was always to include all sectors, including finance. And indeed, the Commission's draft expressly said that finance was included. But there's a real rearguard action, I think, by some members of that business sector, represented by some states who are questioning whether now is the time to introduce banks, pension providers, traders and investors into this law. So we will likely have an answer on that in the new year. Let me just check my time. I think I'm almost at time, but I will perhaps just touch briefly on this last slide, Bridget, if we can skip one more. What does all this mean for Africa, for businesses in Africa, and for policy makers in Africa? And just a few points to put up there, and we can come back to this perhaps in the discussion. Firstly, I know that many African states are working on their own policy proposals for how to implement their duty under the UN guiding principles in their own national laws and policy toolkit. These are called national action plans. There's already been one in Kenya. There's been one passed in Uganda. I know that the government of Ghana has been working on its own national action plan, and there are reported NAPs in development in Liberia, Nigeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Tanzania, Zambia, and perhaps elsewhere. Secondly, the African Forum on Business and Human Rights is the first time there's a regional summit, which was co-hosted with the UN on business and human rights in Africa. The first was held in Accra in October 2022, with a follow-up second session just last September in Ethiopia. So I think it's clear that this discussion is now being seized by African voices, African policymakers, African businesses, and African civil society campaigners to really shape their own approach to these very challenging issues, mindful of what's being done elsewhere, but not simply following where they have led. I've mentioned already the idea of African businesses in other companies' value chains and what this means for your own corporate partnerships in terms of having to find and report this data. So I won't dwell on that here. I do want to say that I know there are African solutions to many of these problems faced in Africa, and a real hope that Africa can, and different players within Africa can drive these discussions. And as part of that, to attract international investment into homegrown businesses, which can challenge and compete on the world stage. My view is increasingly that is going to require robust ESG legislative landscapes to give comfort to those international investors that they can have a level playing field when investing in Africa as opposed to investing in Europe or the US or elsewhere. And lastly, of course, ESG impacts fall all around the world, but often fall in Africa. And very conscious of this as the climate change discussions play out in COP, that sometimes those parts of the world who have done the least to create some of the global problems we have, particularly in terms of environmental collapse and crisis, are those parts of the world who are struggling most to be heard and to take charge of the future. They perhaps contributed least to the problems, but suffering the most from the damage. I've talked about that in the context of the environment, but I think it is also true across other aspects of environmentalism and on the social side. So I think it's only fair that Africa demands to have its voice heard, not only within Africa, but when engaging with stakeholders from around the world as well. And if I can ever be of any assistance, it would be a great pleasure to do that. And I hope that this presentation has been helpful, and I look forward to taking part in further discussions after we've heard from John. Thank you very much for your time.
So I will start. I think we've heard a lot today. We've heard from our two panelists, and I think in your minds, you'll be asking the question, how do we start? How is it so applicable to the business that you're doing or the the consultancy work that you are on, or as an actor, how do you play in all these things? Well, it's a valid question. I want to walk you through what DBG does. Unfortunately, we couldn't play the video, but I think on the latter end, I'll just get some time and play the video on what we're doing. So basically, DBG is a development finance institution and been set up almost barely 2 years ago. And it's not your typical commercial bank. It's a wholesale development bank. And what does it do? We mobilize funding from our development partners like African Development Bank, EIB, the World Bank, and KfW. And our mandate is to deploy funding to the SMEs, meaning the private sector. Now, not just any private sector. Before the bank was set up, a team was set up to identify why businesses are within certain sectors, such as the agribusiness, manufacturing, transportation, hospitality, and high-value services, and the others. Why are banks not really lending to these areas? And as a vehicle, as an intervention, the development bank was set up. It was set up to provide funding to financial institutions who had to, not just any financial institution, you had to go through a whole due diligence. And this due diligence, one of the requirements is you evidencing that you have a robust environmental and social management system. Now you'll be hearing words like ESG, environmental and social policy, sustainability policy. Well, it's bottom line, it's all means basically the same thing. It's a system and as well as a standard, right? So I'll quickly go through some few slides with you and guide us all and learn together how Development Bank Ghana is integrating environmental and social management system in its processes as well as with its partners. So if I may, so we basically are driven at the start of the bank. One of the first systems that we had, even before any other policy emerged in the bank, was an environmental and social management system. And what does it mean? It basically means that as a bank, before even we start even employing staff and even the CEO in, there was a need for us to streamline and get a sustainability framework, which comprises of our policy, our manual, the tools that we work with in the bank in terms of identifying partner banks that have this requirement, and also how we also develop a framework to guide our banks to be able to embed this and not just having a policy line under the shelf or on the shelf, and you only present it when you are looking for money or engaging partners. Well, my background has been quite useful in this exercise because I've been in the commercial bank before and I happen to understand what their needs and how they are gearing up to be able to build capacity in this space. So the first is that we established a framework, a policy where, and as earlier mentioned, the central bank has the Ghana Sustainable Banking Principles, which was started before even the bank was established. It was done in 2019. The bank was the bank started as a project, and it started through a project, and we're now a bank. Now, beyond that, we also align to the World Bank standards. Some will say, is the World Bank standard different from the IFC standard? Yes, they are two separate standards. The World Bank standard calls its standards the environmental and social standards, whilst the IFC calls it as a performance standards. The difference is that World Bank has 10, and if I could, to be interactive, could someone tell me how many standards do we have with the IFC, just to be interactive? If you could type it on the chat so that we could, okay. Whilst we wait for that, So the IFC is, I'll say, a sister body of the main World Bank, and they draw a lot of the standards from the World Bank. So because we are financed by the World Bank, we align to those standards. And why? Because we use a common approach. A common approach means that you have various development partners. We have 4 development partners, and all of them are so keen on how you'd embed environmental and social management system in your operations, not just operations, but also in your investment processes, and even how you even identify potential partners. Now, number 2 of what we do is, beyond we identifying our partners, internally, we build capacity with our various frontline. So on our front line, we have a team called the wholesale lending team that we provide capacity building, so that whilst we both interface with the PFI, okay, someone said 8 standards, great. Whilst we are integrating throughout the bank, because you will be in a conversation, a meeting with a partner bank, and they're asking about ESG. You don't need to call the team, the ESG team, to answer some few questions. No, we've spent almost barely the past 2 years building capacity at the front line as well as internally, so that we both speak the same language. And rightly mentioned earlier, it's not only about the environment. We always, I guess it's because it starts with an E, right? There's a social part that is really, really very important, that a lot of institutions or companies really do not embed that. And it's your typical labor management system. I'd rightly said, how are you attracting various employees to be part of the organization? What is the culture? What is the employee satisfaction service? What are the key issues that are making employees stay, and what's really making them move out of the bank? Again, the question is, why is this important? It's so important because investors want to place money in institutions or companies that give impact, not just financial impact, but also impact in terms of employees and also improving livelihood. We mentioned earlier about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These are critical things that companies would target each of these goals and address them by responding to various action, or some would say climate action, but there's also SDG actions that businesses are supposed to comply to, or not comply, but adhere to, right? Now, we, as a bank, for the past also 2 years, we've signed on to the UN Global Compact. In fact, it was one of the first things that we did, and it shows how responsible the bank is, as well as how the CEO and management are committed to embedding sustainability, not just being a lip service, but internally providing support to myself and my team in terms of building capacity, as well as ensuring that the right things are done and adhered. And again, why are we doing this? Not just to get ready for investment, but also align it internally within the bank, so that we know that beyond just funding, it's well integrated within the bank, and it's really embedded in how we even interact with our partners. So as a bank, we have a policy, we have a procedure, we have a guidelines that we are meant for the banks. And we show this by showing commitment and adhering that we have one of the best expertise within the bank, and we have the competencies and the tools. Now, you're wondering why I left the 4th one. I'm coming to that, right? Now, the way our model is, we are not just waiting for our money to be deployed or to be exhausted. We're currently using the mandates that we are currently sourcing and sourcing additional funding from our development partners. Why are we doing that? There are several climate eligible projects that exist, right, in this country, and we know that we are heavily affected by climate change, right? So how do we as a country position ourselves to mobilize funding so that it can be deployed? And one of the ways that we are doing is that we are co-creating products with our partners. So I mentioned our partners in the earlier slide, that we don't just ensure that we embed it, but also we build products with them. And that is one thing that we currently are spearheading across the financial sector. We don't see ESG as a compliance that you need to quickly put up together and show to the regulator or any DFI partner that you want to do business with. It also means that how are you positioning well to ensure that you are deploying, you are creating value by identifying businesses that are in climate and also gender financing product. Let me move to the next slide. I think I have to be faster, right? So this is how we see ESG, right? And how we are implementing ESG. We see it as a policy and a process. Yes, we are strengthening. We have a policy that we are strengthening our capacity of our partner banks, not just to be a system of risk and compliance, but also a management system where we track both the risk management, the impact, and also we do a lot of how we leveraging to resource funding. Now, in the funding aspect means that we need to also prepare our financial partners to be able to understand how to design or co-create green financing products. So currently, hello?
Sorry to interrupt you, John. You have 5 minutes.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so I would just highlight on these few areas and maybe quickly move. So we, beyond just having the risk and the product, the policies and the documentation, we see it as a profit center, right? We are moving towards a profit center because I'm very keen on this, is as a country or various banks, there are enough systems that ensure that, especially with our partner banks, that they have the governance system in terms of implementing these things. But the question is that, how are they cascading this to the SMEs that they finance? And that is very critical. And beyond that, we see it as a programming because it's a continuous learning environment. You just don't have a box to check, but also continuously improving what you have by aligning to various reporting requirements, just as mentioned. We have the GRI, the TCFDs, and all those stuff, right? And also partnerships. Partnerships in terms of how do you sign on to certifications to ensure that you're not just aligning to that, but also you've been able to embed, just as we've been able to sign on to the UN Global Compact. And also one of the partnerships and bodies that we sign up to, the 2X Challenge. The 2X Challenge is a gender mainstreaming initiative that commits institutions who align to them to develop a framework where they align women and also women-owned or women-led financing products into their business. Well, I would quickly move here to talk more about how we are deploying funding, because all these things are ESG linked and ESG embedded financing requirements. So again, because we don't lend directly, we are positioned to be a catalyst to climate financing, and not just being a catalyst, but also work with the banks to be able to realize pipelines with our partners and also being able to drive policy and advocacy. Ghana has the NDCs, which has 47 action points. We already have the worldwide SDG ambitions and goals. And the question is that, what is Ghana doing in this regard to meet those targets? And also various policy frameworks like the energy transition framework. How is the government of Ghana or its actors like Development Bank, as well as the private sector, contributing to the target set by to achieve? Now, I quickly wanted to do this to give you an overview of, so there's a document that was just released some few years ago, right? And this report gives a state of account of ESG, right? And it gives an improvement perception or improvement target, right? Where it says that 71 of C-suite leaders agree and strongly agree that ESG will play an increasing role in corporate performance. 60% of the companies also agree that it is a value addition, right? And 56% agree, right, that it is important for business to be aligned with this framework. And then lastly, ESG management is currently carried out by 91% of companies. They use third-party solutions. And I really want to talk about third-party solutions. Just like Koranteng and Koranteng legal firm, they provide an assurance to companies who would want to attest whether indeed you are really aligning to the ESG framework. Now, just to touch on what exists currently in Ghana here, just a few slides, if I may. We have the Ghana Sustainable Banking Principle developed by the Bank of Ghana. It has 7, in fact, it has 6 principles and a reporting requirement, making 7, and also has 5 guidance notes, right? Now, I think maybe this is available online, you could look at it, but one of the key things that Bank of Ghana is really driving in this end is that they expect banks to come up with a policy and a framework where they show evidence of how they are implementing the environmental and social risks management framework. Now, beyond that, they want to also see how they are internalizing within the organization. We have, we just heard that how our banks embedding governance, right? The governance includes, right, corporate governance. It also includes how you're currently implementing this within your bank, and also how they cascade this to their SMEs that they finance. Well, there's also the gender mainstreaming aspect of it, which shows that how as a bank, and also how you are supporting your SME to improve them in terms of ensuring that you provide some allotment in terms of encouraging women-owned businesses and how you tend to support them with financing. And also financial inclusion has to do with how businesses, how banks are supporting businesses to drive financial inclusion, and also providing financing so that we just don't leave anyone behind. Well, I would jump right to resource efficiency. It basically says that how are banks taking responsibility and ensure that they are financing businesses that actually promote responsible consumption and also embedding sustainable practices within their operations. Now, I believe that we also heard about the Ghana Stock Exchange and its ESG disclosure. So I would stop here by highlighting the value proposition of ESG integration in business strategy. One, it is true, it is evidence that it has increased profit. How is this done? Because the more you embed and being cognizant with the end-to-end life cycle of a project, and you embed the right assessment tools, you tend to cut costs and also be efficient, and therefore maintain profit or increase profit rather than reduce losses. Now, the second one has to do with all businesses are located in a community, right? And therefore, it is the responsibility of business. A responsible business is a business that embeds ESG within its business operations by ensuring that whether it requires an environmental permit or requires an FDA license to operate, it begins the process of regularizing those ones and ensuring that they comply with the requirements. The social safeguards and also the legal requirements had to do with both grievance redress mechanisms that are exist and the legal ramifications of non-compliance. And again,
John.
you're improving community.
Hello?
Hello?
Hi, John. Can we just conclude on that, please? You have just a few seconds.
Okay. So, and again, you are improving upon communities, like I said. You are not just deteriorating the existence of those communities and the people that live in there, but also providing impact such as providing jobs and livelihood improvement, and also aligned to the SDGs. And the last one is how it positions new customers. You have customers who would want to have or work with responsible businesses. We've had cases of where companies have been blacklisted or have been publicized for using wrong application of chemicals in their operations, and it really creates what we call reputational issues, and investors don't want to do business with them, as well as customers don't want to let these companies provide service to them. So I'll pause here and yield to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, John, for that thought-provoking presentation and the information on ESG, especially in the financial sector and the Bank of Ghana arrangements that have been made to promote ESG. Now, thank you once again. Thank you once again to all our panelists for sharing your experiences and knowledge with us. For everyone, if you have any questions and thoughts, please share them in the chat box that you see on your screen. And we'll have a Q&A session. And as we get ready to transition into that Q&A session, I will engage our panelists on a few thought-provoking questions or thoughts that I have put down myself. So in no particular order, I think I would start with Effie. Hi, Effie.
Hello. Hi, Bridget.
Okay. So
any difficult questions can go to John and Adam. Good.
Okay. Thank you for that presentation earlier on, especially on the HR bits. So my first question to you is, if you can provide more insights into recent developments or trends in relation to ESG that businesses, should be aware of in recent times.
Okay. Trends. I think that we've spoken, I think all the panelists have spoken quite a bit about what's happening with ESG. But I think one of the things I said in my presentation was how dynamic the environment is, because the principles really sort of very much align to social change. So as things develop socially, so does the benchmarks around ESG. So I guess I can give you an example. We've all been talking about COP and the climate agenda. So I'm sure you have all heard about climate finance, and I know that John was talking a bit about that. So that's sort of a whole new area that's opened up now, where countries are beginning to basically create financial products based on their carbon emissions and carbon usage. So there's a whole business framework now around carbon, which is very, very much linked with what's happening around ESG. So that's a new area, for example, that I can think of. There is the advent of AI and how that is going to impact on, employment, on business practices, on just the way we live. And I can see that having an impact on how ESG frameworks are built going forward, particularly around metrics, around measurements, etc. Diversity and inclusion is a big one for us here in Africa. It feels as if the conversation was settled in the rest of the world, but now we also know that in Africa, that conversation is beginning around diversity and inclusion and what it means in our context, given the laws that are being proposed in multiple countries across the continent that have direct impact on diversity and inclusion. When you look at what's happening, in outside of Africa, there's a big conversation around pushback on diversity and inclusion, and how does that sort of impact on ESG. So I can see all of these pieces being sort of the new frontier to the conversation around ESG.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you for that, Effie. I have a number of questions, so I think I'll just jump into that as well. This is okay. So Dennis Dennis Owusueje. Dennis is asking, how do we ensure that the country, its people, and other resources are not abused by businesses that originate from outside the country? Efe, would you like to take that?
Yeah,
I know you've been talking about
I
it.
can give my opinion. I don't know that it's a considered opinion. I think, it really begins on, I think we talked about the various frameworks that the various countries set up for themselves. So what are the regulations that the government of Ghana and the people of Ghana are putting in place to check all organizations, not just multinationals or international organizations, but all organizations in upholding certain set of values, whether it is our environmental laws or whether it is our sustainability programs or whatever laws we've put into place. What sort of framework is the country itself putting in place to check these organizations? I think that that's the first step. If we can get that right, then that in itself controls quite a bit of what anybody coming to play in our market is sort of the behavior. They are constrained by our rules and regulations. So I think that that's really the first part is the national agenda around our own sustainability and ESG framework.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Dennis, I hope your question has been answered. Kwame is also asking, and John, I think you will take this. He's asking, how do startups or SMEs in local communities tie in the ESG framework, and how would it benefit their growth?
Okay, I would.
Take that again.
Yeah, I think I got the question.
Okay.
So, one is banks are now being asked to not just check a box, but also be in a position of supporting SMEs to transform or to be in a position of aligning their requirements, ESG requirements, beyond just their business operation, but also what they are currently financing, right? So, for instance, you have a beverage company that is coming up that wants to scale and would require various FDA requirements, and banks are now telling SMEs to be in a position of supporting them to regularize those gaps and actually providing not just funding, but also advisory support to businesses. So, I mean, based on the Ghana Sustainable Banking Principles, it's more of a step further, not just to look on whether you identify whether you have all the requirements, but also be in a position of helping businesses transform and regularize the non-compliantness of businesses that they support. So again, banks are coming up with clinics, SME clinics, and also working with other stakeholders to ensure that they provide, they help them to regularize those businesses that are not in compliance with environmental and social requirements.
Okay, all right, thank you. Tabitha, asking how can its processes or does profits come on companies for profits? Adam, would you like to take this?
I didn't quite hear the question. Let me just look in the Q&A. Oh, here we go.
I'll
Tabitha, how can an NGO be intentional about incorporating ESG frameworks into its processes, or does ESG only focus on the profit companies? Great question. Let me first add a comment to what John rightly said in response to SMEs. I think with SMEs and mid-sized companies, there's both an extra challenge and also an extra opportunity. The challenge typically is one of resource and headcount, and you're striving to keep the business going and growing, and it can seem difficult to find the headcount within the business to focus on some of the sustainability due diligence and reporting. I think that is a very real challenge, and likely why SMEs are sometimes excluded from some of the regulations. But the opportunity, I think, is that when you are small and nimble, you can set up for the future. And so I would say that looking at some of the sustainability frameworks as you are starting to build the company at a young age means that you can grow with a view to embedding these sustainability things through your policies and processes in the future. Much easier to do it when you're an SME and then grow with them and tweak them than to grow and then try to retrofit policies and practices around sustainability at a later date, which is exactly one of the problems that large companies are finding now. On NGOs, typically they are excluded, I think, from the regulatory side of ESG, but then also, particularly if they're registered as charities, at least in certain jurisdictions, they will have their own governance requirements around impact and around meeting their own charitable objectives. So for other NGOs, typically, again, won't have the same due diligence requirements in law, but will increasingly be judged against the same or similar questions around impact and risk. So I would say that the new laws are very useful to NGOs by analogy, and that they should look at their own policies and processes using some of the same tools and ideas and procedures that are being refined and improved in the private sector, but with a view to ensuring that they are refining their approach in a similar way. The other note on NGOs perhaps is that some of these new laws and some of the court cases are providing an enhanced opportunity for NGOs to make their voice heard, to push for the kind of outcomes and processes that they would like to see. And in fact, in my firm a few years ago, we represented 2 NGOs in the UK Supreme Court on exactly one of these human rights parent company liability cases, so they can find new strategic ways of pushing for their objectives as part of the broader business and human rights system. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you for that, Adam. Dennis is asking, what are regulators and stakeholders doing to guide business operations to align with sustainable and best practice? I think initially we had pointed out that, to answer you, Dennis, that Ghana has put in place the energy transition framework. I know John had also mentioned the sustainable banking principles that have been put together by the Bank of Ghana, as well as the Ghana Stock Exchange guidance, which also makes it compulsory for certain disclosures to be made with regards to ESG reporting. Also, there's been the recent COP28 that Ghana has taken part in. These are all measures to advance towards ESG in the country. So to answer your question, regulators and local stakeholders have been very active in this sector to create sustainable and best practices towards ESG. And then we have a question. Jesse is asking, how do ESG policies accommodate cultural differences and value differences? And he says, for example, some traditional farms in some African and Asian countries use child labor of family members as accepted practice, where some Western corporations view that negatively. Adam, would you like to take that?
Sure, thank you. That's a good example, because previously I did some work for an international technology company who had said, well, all these new laws around child labor are causing us some problems. So we suggest just saying that anyone operating in our supply chain globally must be 18 or above. And our advice at the end of the day was, you must be aware of unintended consequences of seemingly simple solutions, precisely because in some respects, these employment opportunities are if you don't think about what you're replacing the opportunity with, then you could be causing problems from a social point of view, as well as trying to solve them. I would say that human rights has been developed as an international kind of body of law over various decades, with input from different cultures, from different parts of the world, and so as a framework, I think hopefully it builds in a lot of those cultural differences and different perspectives already, and then provides for a certain amount of context-specific application, and you see that in how human rights can be interpreted uniformly, but applied in a context-specific way in different parts of the world and from different courts. So I do subscribe to the idea that there is a minimum level of human rights respect, which is got to be common across all parts of the world, and so not a completely kind of relative position based on kind of traditional practices and conventions. But I do know that it needs to be these things need to be taken into account carefully when rolling out solutions. So if you're looking at traditions of young family members providing labour on family farms, and there's a policy view that needs to be removed, including from a human rights point of view, then how are you going to address the gap of income, and is that something that can be done immediately, or do you require a transitional process? So I think my answer would, in short, be very aware of and looking for unintended consequences of trying to impose solutions, but ultimately human rights provides the same protections for people of all different cultures.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Adam. I think we can take one last question, and John, this will go to you. If you can just answer this in 10 seconds, yeah? So the question is, how do PFIs ensure ESG are properly integrated in their lending decisions?
Well, you said 30 seconds. I'll give you 30 seconds.
10 seconds.
One is knowledge management. We don't just invest in with our PFIs by deploying capital. We continuously provide technical assistance to them, and thereby they enhancing their knowledge. And two is we have a framework called the monitoring framework, where we go on site to our partner banks to learn how they are integrating ESG within their credit operations. Thank you. Hello. Should I add the last one? So the last one will be the reporting. We require our partner banks to provide reporting to us on a quarterly basis, and it also gives a sense of learning how they are embedding these frameworks within their credit operations. Thank you.
Okay, I'm back. I think I lost the connection. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, but you want me to
Yes, we can hear you. The question was dealt with in your absence.
Okay, all right. Okay, so thank you so much. I want to express our gratitude to you, Effie, to Adam, and to John for sharing your unique experiences and expertise on ESG. To our audience, thank you for your time today. It has been an absolute pleasure having you, despite the hitches here and there. And thank you also for being with us throughout the year. I am certain that as we move into 2024, we are, well garnered to, practice ESG in our business operations. And please reach out to us if you have any concerns, if you have any comments, or if you have any questions at info@korantengandkoranteng.com. And thank you all very much. Merry Christmas from us here at Koranteng and Koranteng, and see you next year. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you. And Adam and John, lovely having you. Take care.
Pleasure. Likewise.
Bye.
Happy holidays, everyone. Yes.